Some women bury their husbands and think the hardest part is over. I buried mine on a rainy Tuesday in April, and I found out 3 weeks later that grief wasn't even close to the hardest part. The hardest part came from someone who still had a pulse, sitting 2 chairs down from me in a lawyer's conference room, wearing my dead husband's favorite color like she'd planned it. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 61 years old. I run a small floral and gift shop on Maple Street, in a town outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where people still wave at you from their porches, and the mail carrier knows your dog's name. I built that shop from nothing 22 years ago with $4,000 in savings and a used delivery van that smelled like carnations no matter how many times I cleaned it. My husband Robert used to say I could sell flowers to a florist. He wasn't wrong. That business put our son through college. It kept the lights on during 2 recessions. And it was still standing, still mine, the week my whole family tried to convince me I didn't matter anymore. Robert and I were married for 34 years. He was an engineer, quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed the garbage disposal without being asked, and left love notes in my lunch bag when I was too busy running the shop to eat breakfast. We had one son, Michael. I won't sit here and tell you Michael was a difficult child, because he wasn't. He was sweet, soft-spoken, a little too eager to keep the peace, even as a boy. If Robert and I ever raised our voices in another room, Michael would appear in the doorway asking if everything was okay. That trait, keeping the peace at any cost, followed him straight into adulthood, and eventually, straight into a marriage that would cost his own mother more than he'll ever fully understand. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you stories like this one, and I always love knowing who's listening. Drop the state or country you're tuning in from down in the comments. Now, let's get back to it. Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 11 months before he died. 11 months. I know women who've had less warning than that, and I know women who've had more, and I can tell you with complete honesty that no amount of warning prepares you for the actual day. We spent those 11 months the way you'd expect. Doctor's appointments, second opinions. A short-lived stretch of hope after a clinical trial showed promise, followed by the long, quiet slide when it stopped working. Robert handled it the way he handled everything else in his life, calmly, practically, with far more concern for how I would manage afterward than any fear for himself. About 4 months before he passed, when he was still lucid and strong enough to sit upright for an hour at a time, Robert called our family attorney, a man named Frank Delacroix, who had handled our affairs for nearly 20 years. Robert wanted things settled properly. He wanted no ambiguity, no arguments, no mess left behind for me to clean up while grieving. I sat in on most of those conversations. I signed what I needed to sign. I trusted my husband completely, the way I had for over 3 decades, and I didn't ask too many questions about the specifics, because frankly, thinking too hard about the paperwork meant admitting he was actually going to die. Grief has a way of making you avoid detail, even when detail is exactly what you need. Robert passed on a Tuesday in April, at 4:47 in the morning, with my hand in his. Michael and Vanessa had been at the house the night before, but had gone home to relieve the babysitter watching their 2 kids. I was alone with him when he went, which some people find sad, and which I have always found to be the single most sacred thing that ever happened to me. 34 years, and I got to be the last face he saw. The funeral was 3 days later, small, dignified, the way Robert would have wanted it. Michael gave a eulogy that made half the room cry, myself included, though I noticed even then, in the middle of my grief, that Vanessa spent most of the service checking her phone under the pew in front of her. I told myself it wasn't the moment to notice things like that. I was wrong. It was exactly the moment to notice things like that. I just wasn't ready to. 3 weeks after the funeral, Frank Delacroix called to schedule the will reading. "Standard procedure," he said. "Nothing to worry about. Just a formality now that the estate needed to move through probate." I remember feeling almost relieved to have something concrete to do, some box to check, some piece of the process that had a clear beginning and end. unlike grief itself, which just seems to go on and on with no shape to it at all. We gathered in Frank's conference room on a Thursday morning. Me, Michael, Vanessa. The two grandkids were with a sitter, thankfully, because what happened in that room was not something children needed to witness. I sat at the head of the table, out of habit more than intention, the way you sit at the head of a table when you've spent 30 years sitting across from the same man at dinner, and your body simply goes there without asking your brain first. Vanessa sat down across from me, smoothed her blazer, and before Frank had even opened his folder, she leaned toward Michael and said something under her breath. I didn't catch all of it. I caught enough. Not going to be an issue much longer. And I caught the small, satisfied smile that followed it, the kind of smile you give someone when you already know how a story ends, and you're the one who wrote the ending. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? Frank cleared his throat, opened the folder, and started reading. And that's the part of this story where everything genuinely changed, though it would take another 3 weeks for me to understand exactly how much. To understand what happened in that conference room, and everything that came after, you need to understand who Vanessa was, and more importantly, who she became over the 8 years she was married to my son. Michael met Vanessa at 26, at a work conference in Chicago. She was sharp, ambitious, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately identified who was worth talking to. I'll be fair to her, because fairness matters to me even now. She was genuinely good at her job, something in corporate marketing, and she was genuinely devoted to Michael in her own way, at least in those early years. Robert liked her instantly. He said she reminded him of me when I was younger, all drive and no patience for people wasting her time. I laughed when he said that. I don't laugh about it anymore. The shift happens slowly, the way these things usually do. It's never one dramatic moment. It's 1,000 small ones, stacked so gradually, you don't notice the weight until you're already buried under it. It started with small comments about our house, the one Robert and I had lived in for 26 years. Vanessa would visit for Sunday dinners and mention, almost offhandedly, how much the property was probably worth now, how the market in our neighborhood had really taken off. At first I thought it was harmless curiosity, real estate small talk, plenty of people do it. But it kept happening, again and again, at every visit, until it stopped feeling like small talk and started feeling like an inventory. Then came the caregiving years, when Robert got sick. I want to be honest here, because I think honesty matters more than making myself look like a saint. I did almost all of it. The doctor's appointments, the medication schedules, the nights sitting up when he couldn't sleep from the pain, running my shop with one hand while holding my dying husband's hand with the other. Michael helped when he could, and I loved him for trying, genuinely. But Vanessa was scarce. Convenient excuses. Work trips that always seemed to land during the worst weeks. A birthday party for one of the kids that somehow couldn't be moved, even though Robert had a procedure scheduled that same afternoon that we both knew might be his last good day for a while. I never said a word about it to Michael. I didn't want to put my son in the middle of anything, and frankly, I still believed, right up until that morning in Frank's office, that whatever distance had grown between Vanessa and me was just family friction, the normal, forgivable kind. Every family has some. Then there was the matter of the house itself, which Robert and I had actually started discussing with Michael and Vanessa about a year before Robert got sick. We'd talked, in a general, someday sort of way, about eventually downsizing and possibly helping Michael and Vanessa with a larger home for their growing family, using some of the equity from ours. Nothing was decided, nothing was promised. It was the kind of conversation families have around a holiday table, half hope, half hypothetical. Vanessa did not treat it as hypothetical. Over the following months, I started noticing the way she talked about our house in front of other people, at a cousin's wedding, at a neighborhood barbecue. Once we get the Hale place, she said once to a woman I barely knew, like it was already a closing date on a calendar. I remember standing there holding a plate of potato salad, completely speechless, while Robert, ever the peacemaker, gently changed the subject and later told me privately not to make a thing of it. "She gets ahead of herself," he said. "She doesn't mean any harm by it." I wanted to believe him. I always wanted to believe him. He was usually right about people. He wasn't right about this one. I understand now that he knew it too, in his own quiet way, which is exactly why, in his final months, while I was busy holding his hand and pretending the ending wasn't coming, my husband was in the next room with Frank Delacroix, making very sure his wife of 34 years would never be at the mercy of anyone's assumptions about the Hale place. Robert protected me before he even told me I needed protecting. That's the kind of man he was. The last conversation I remember having with Robert about all of this happened maybe 6 weeks before he died. On one of his good afternoons, sitting up in bed with the window open and the smell of my hydrangeas drifting in from the yard he'd planted for me 15 years earlier. "Whatever happens after I'm gone," he said, taking my hand in both of his, which had gotten so thin by then, I could feel every knuckle. "You are not going to be homeless in your own life, Margaret. I've made sure of that. I need you to trust me on this, even if you don't fully understand it yet." I told him I trusted him completely. I meant it. I still mean it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was just how badly I would need that trust to hold 3 weeks after his funeral, sitting in a conference room, watching my daughter-in-law smile, like she already knew how the story was going to end. Frank read through the will methodically, the way lawyers do, working through the smaller bequests first, a modest sum to Michael's children for their education, a donation to the Veterans Hospital where Robert had volunteered for years, some of his tools and his father's old watch, left specifically to Michael, which made my son cry quietly at the table, and made even Vanessa's expression soften for a moment. Just a moment. Then Frank got to the house. "The property at 214 Birchwood Lane," he read, "is held in a life estate, granting Margaret Hale full and exclusive right to occupy, use, and benefit from the residence for the duration of her natural life. Upon Margaret Hale's death, ownership of the remainder interest transfers to Michael Hale." I watched Vanessa's face while Frank said it, and I want you to understand something. I have never in my life seen an expression shift that fast. The polite, patient mask she'd worn all morning simply fell off, like a curtain dropping. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes cut sideways to Michael, sharp, accusing, like he was somehow responsible for this and hadn't warned her. "I'm sorry," she said, cutting Frank off mid-sentence, which even Frank, a very composed man, wasn't quite prepared for. "What does that mean exactly? A life estate? Does that mean the house isn't actually Michael's?" Frank, to his credit, remained perfectly calm. "It means the house belongs, in full legal use and occupancy, to Margaret for as long as she lives. Michael holds what's called the remainder interest, meaning ownership eventually passes to him, but only after Margaret's passing, and only in the condition the property is in at that time. Margaret retains complete decision-making authority over the home during her lifetime, including whether to sell it, rent it, or remain in it." I watched something calculate behind Vanessa's eyes, fast, the way you watch a person doing math they don't like the answer to. "So she could live there for another 30 years, she said. Not to me, to Frank, like I wasn't even sitting 3 feet away from her. "And there's nothing anyone can do about that." "That's correct," Frank said simply. Before we get further into this, if you've been enjoying the story so far, go ahead and hit that like button, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, back to the story, because this is the part where things got genuinely ugly. Vanessa didn't say much else in the meeting. She sat with her arms crossed, her jaw set, and I could feel the temperature of the room drop about 10 degrees. Michael looked like a man caught between 2 tectonic plates, glancing at his wife, then at me, then back down at the table, saying absolutely nothing, which, if I'm honest, had become something of a pattern for my son over the past several years. Peace, at any cost. even when peace meant silence in the face of something that needed a voice. We left the office separately. I drove home to an empty house that still smelled faintly like Robert's aftershave in the hallway closet, and I sat at my kitchen table and cried the kind of tears you cry when grief and confusion get tangled up together and you can't tell anymore which one you're actually mourning. I didn't hear from Michael or Vanessa for 11 days. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, I decided to drive over to their house, the one Robert and I had helped them buy the down payment for years earlier, to drop off some of the grandkids' old photo albums I'd been sorting through, things I thought they'd want. I used my key, the same key I'd had for 6 years. The key I used to let myself in on Sundays, to help watch the kids while Michael and Vanessa ran errands. The key didn't work. I stood there on the porch for a full minute, jiggling it, convinced I was doing something wrong, before Vanessa opened the door herself, arms crossed, standing in the doorway like a woman guarding a border. "We changed the locks," she said, flat, no apology in it at all. "Oh," I said, genuinely confused. "Is everything all right? Did something happen?" "Margaret," she said, "and I want you to notice, she didn't say Mom. She hadn't called me Mom in years, actually, but this time, even the pretense of warmth was gone entirely. I think it's time we're honest with each other. You're not welcome here anymore. Not after that stunt at the lawyer's office." "Stunt?" I said. "Vanessa, I didn't do anything. Your father-in-law made those arrangements himself, months ago, before he passed." "Sure he did," she said, in a tone that made it very clear she believed nothing of the sort. "Look, I don't know what kind of influence you had over him at the end, when he wasn't exactly himself, but Michael and I have our own lives to build, and we can't have you hovering, showing up unannounced, acting like you still have a say in things. You need to stay on your own from now on. This isn't your house, and honestly, it's time you accepted that ours isn't either, until you're gone." I stood on that porch, holding a box of photo albums, 34 years of family memories, tucked in a cardboard box against my hip, and I genuinely did not have words. I've been hurt in my life. I lost my own mother young. I buried my husband 3 weeks earlier. None of it prepared me for the specific, surgical cruelty of being told by my own son's wife that my continued existence was simply an inconvenience she was waiting out. Michael appeared behind her in the hallway. He didn't say a word. He didn't correct her. He didn't even meet my eyes. He just stood there, the same way he'd stood in that lawyer's office, caught between two women, choosing, in the end, to choose nothing at all, which I have come to understand is its own kind of choice, and rarely the kind that leads anywhere good. I set the box down on the porch step, because I genuinely could not hold on to it and my own composure at the same time, and I turned around and walked back to my car. I didn't cry until I was 3 blocks away, pulled over on the side of the road with my hazard lights on, because I did not trust myself to drive through that grief without causing an accident. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, with a cup of tea gone cold in front of me, I made a decision. Not out of anger, though the anger was there, simmering under everything else. Out of clarity. The same kind of clarity, I imagine, that settles into a person right before they stop asking a locked door to open for them and start asking who has the authority to unlock it in the first place. I picked up my phone, and I called Frank Delacroix. Frank picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, the way a man does when he's been your family's attorney for 2 decades and has learned to recognize the particular tone in your voice when something's gone wrong. "Margaret," he said, "you sound like you've had a rough week." I told him everything. The changed locks, the words on that porch, the complete, chilling silence from my own son. Frank listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, letting you get the whole story out before they start solving it. "Margaret," he said finally, "I need you to understand something clearly, because I don't think it's landed for you yet, and it hasn't landed for them either. Robert didn't just leave you a place to live. He gave you full legal control of that property for the rest of your life. That includes the right to sell it, rent it, or do anything else with it you choose. Michael's interest in that house doesn't exist yet. It's a future interest. It means nothing, legally, until you're gone. I sat with that for a moment. I don't want to sell my home, Frank. I just want to understand my rights, because apparently my own family thinks I don't have any. You have all of them, he said. Every single one. If you're finding this story compelling, take a second to subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. It genuinely means a lot to see how far these stories travel. Now, back to what happened next, because this is the part where things got a great deal more complicated and a great deal more clear. About 10 days after that phone call, I got a call from my neighbor, Dottie, a sweet woman in her 70s who's lived across the street from Robert and me since before Michael was born. Dottie has a habit of checking real estate listings for fun, the way some people do crossword puzzles, and she called me on a Tuesday morning sounding confused. "Margaret," she said, "I think there's some kind of mistake. I just saw your house listed for sale online. 214 Birchwood. Is that right? Are you moving?" My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees. "Dottie," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage, "can you send me that listing right now?" She did, and there it was. My house. My home of 26 years. The one with Robert's hydrangeas still blooming in the side yard. The one where I'd held his hand the morning he died, listed for sale by a real estate agency 2 towns over, with photographs that had clearly been taken recently, professionally staged, my furniture pushed aside, my grandmother's quilt folded up and tucked out of frame like it was clutter to be managed rather than a piece of family history. I called Frank immediately, and I could hear my own voice shaking in a way it hadn't shaken even on that porch with Vanessa. "They listed my house," I said, without asking me, without even a phone call. Frank was quiet for a moment on the other end, and then he said something that has stuck with me ever since. "Margaret, they can list the moon for sale if they want to. Listing something and having the legal authority to sell it are 2 entirely different things. Send me the listing. I'll handle the rest today." What we later pieced together, through Frank's inquiries and a very uncomfortable conversation Michael eventually had with his own real estate agent, was that Vanessa had simply assumed, the way she'd assumed most things over the years, that once Robert passed, the house effectively belonged to the family, meaning specifically her and Michael, and that whatever life estate nonsense Frank had read aloud in that meeting was a technicality that could be quietly negotiated around, or waited out, or perhaps simply ignored if they moved fast enough. She'd contacted an agent, staged the listing, and scheduled an open house, all without a single phone call to me, the actual legal owner of the home she was attempting to sell out from under me, while I was still in fact living in it. Frank filed an emergency cease and desist that same afternoon, along with formal notice to the listing agency that the property was under a legally protected life estate, and that any sale, offer, or open house conducted without the life tenant's written consent constituted a serious legal violation, potentially exposing both the agent and the sellers to liability. The listing was pulled from the market within 48 hours. Michael called me that evening. His voice was tight, careful, the voice of a man who knows he's standing on very thin ice and isn't sure yet how deep the water underneath actually is. "Mom," he said, "there's some kind of misunderstanding with the house. Our agent says the listing got pulled, something about a legal notice. Do you know anything about that?" "I know everything about that, Michael," I said, keeping my voice level, gentle even, the way I'd learned to speak to him since he was small, and prone to shutting down the moment he felt cornered. "Your father structured that home so that I would have full authority over it for the rest of my life. You and Vanessa listed my house for sale, without asking me, without even telling me. I found out from Dottie across the street." There was a long silence on the line. Vanessa said, "She said she'd already talked to you about it, that you were fine with it, given everything, given how big the house is for just you now." "Michael," I said, I have not spoken to your wife since she stood in your doorway and told me I was no longer welcome in your home. Does that sound like a conversation where I agreed to sell my house? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about what Vanessa had, and had not, actually told my son. 2 weeks later, we ended up in a small, unremarkable courtroom, the kind with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable wooden benches, because Vanessa, rather than backing down, had pushed forward with a legal challenge of her own, arguing through her own attorney that the life estate should be dissolved or modified on the grounds that I was, and I'm quoting the actual filing here, an elderly woman potentially unable to manage a property of this size and financial complexity alone. I'll let that sit with you for a second, the way it sat with me the first time I read it. My own daughter-in-law's legal strategy, to take my home away from me while I was still grieving my husband of 34 years, was to suggest, in writing, before a judge, that I was too old and too incompetent to be trusted with my own life. If you've stuck with me this long, thank you, genuinely. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments, have you ever had a family member try to convince the world you were less capable than you actually are? I'd love to hear your story too. The hearing itself did not go the way Vanessa's attorney had clearly hoped. Frank presented the will, the life estate documentation, Robert's clear and sound-minded intentions as documented by not one but two independent witnesses present when the estate plan was signed, including Frank himself and Robert's longtime physician, who testified, calmly and clearly, that Robert had been entirely lucid, entirely competent, and entirely deliberate in every decision made regarding his estate. The judge, a woman perhaps a few years younger than me, with sharp eyes and very little patience for what she called, directly from the bench, an attempt to relitigate a dying man's clearly documented wishes based on convenience, dismissed Vanessa's petition in full. Not just dismissed, but noted for the record that the life estate stood exactly as written, with full legal protection, and that any further attempts to list, sell, encumber, or interfere with the property without my written consent would be treated as a direct violation subject to legal penalty. I watched Vanessa's face when the judge said it. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. Mostly, I just felt tired. The particular exhaustion of watching someone you once hoped to love like a daughter reveal, in a courtroom, in front of a judge and a room full of strangers, exactly how little regard she'd ever actually had for you. Michael sat 2 rows behind Vanessa's table, not beside her, which I noticed, and which I think meant something, though I wasn't sure what yet. After the hearing, in the hallway outside, while Vanessa stormed ahead toward the parking garage on her phone with her attorney, Michael approached me alone. He looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely like the boy I raised. Uncertain, a little lost, ashamed, maybe, though I wasn't yet ready to let that shame off easy. "Mom," he said, "I found Dad's letter. The one he left with Frank, the personal one, not the legal stuff. I read it last night." I didn't know there was a personal letter. Frank hadn't mentioned it, and I understood immediately why. Some things are meant to be found, not handed over on a schedule. "He wrote about you," Michael said, his voice cracking slightly. "About how scared he was, near the end, that once he was gone, people would start treating you like you were less than what you actually are. Less capable, less deserving. He wrote that the life estate wasn't about controlling anything from the grave. He said, and I'm going to try to get this right, he said, your mother built a business out of nothing and raised a family while doing it. She does not need anyone's permission to keep living her own life exactly the way she chooses. I am simply making sure nobody takes that choice away from her when I'm not there to stop them myself." I stood in that courthouse hallway and I cried. The kind of crying I hadn't allowed myself since the morning Robert actually died, because somewhere in the middle of all this legal maneuvering and cruelty and exhaustion, I'd almost forgotten that underneath all of it was simply a man who loved me enough to protect me, even after he couldn't be there to do it himself. "I should have said something," Michael said quietly, at the house, in the office. I just, I didn't want to choose between you and her. I told myself staying quiet meant staying neutral. Michael, I said, wiping my face. Staying silent while someone hurts your mother isn't neutral. It's a choice. It was always a choice. You just chose the version that felt easier in the moment. He didn't argue with me. I think for the first time in years, he actually heard me. Vanessa and Michael's marriage did not survive what came after, not because of the house itself, but because of everything the house revealed. The legal fees from the failed challenge were substantial. The strain of a public courtroom loss, and the whispers that followed it through a town where everyone, it turns out, reads the local court filings more closely than you'd think, took its own toll. 6 months after that hearing, Michael called to tell me he and Vanessa had separated. He didn't ask me to feel sorry about it, and I didn't pretend to. It's been a little over a year now since Robert passed, and almost that long since the hearing that made it very clear, in front of a judge, a courtroom, and my own son, that I was neither invisible nor incapable, whatever certain people had hoped I'd become in my grief. I still live at 214 Birchwood Lane. Robert's hydrangeas came back beautifully this spring, the way they do every year, stubborn and unbothered by everything that happened underneath them. I still run my shop on Maple Street, 5 days a week, and I've actually taken on a young assistant, a woman in her 20s who reminds me a little of myself at that age, all ambition and very little patience for people underestimating her. Michael and I talk regularly now. Actually talk. The kind of conversation with real substance in it, not the careful, conflict-avoidant exchanges we used to have when he was busy trying to keep 2 women in his life from ever having to be in the same room. He visits most Sundays now, sometimes with the grandkids, and last month he told me, quietly, over coffee at my kitchen table, that he understood now what his father had been trying to protect me from, and that he was sorry it took a courtroom to teach him something he should have simply known on his own. I did go see Frank again, about 6 weeks after the hearing, not about the house this time, about my own will. I want to be very clear about something in mine, I told him. I never want anyone I love to have to sit in a courtroom fighting for what should have simply been respected in the first place. But I also want to make sure that whatever I leave behind goes to people who understand what it actually took to build it. I've restructured things since then. Michael and the grandchildren are still provided for, generously, because that anger, whatever remained of it, was never really about him, not in the end. But I've also set aside a portion of my estate, and a portion of the shop's future proceeds, toward a fund supporting widows starting small businesses of their own, women who find themselves alone later in life and discover, the way I did, that the world doesn't always make room for you the second way you expect it to. Some evenings, I still sit out on the back porch where Robert used to sit with his coffee, watching the light change over that same yard, and I think about how strange grief actually is. It doesn't just take the person you loved. It reveals, with brutal clarity, exactly who else in your life was standing beside you out of love, and who was simply standing there waiting for their turn. Vanessa never apologized. I don't expect she ever will, and honestly, I've made peace with that. Some people spend their whole lives believing that patience is the same thing as weakness, that quiet dignity means there's nothing underneath it worth fearing. Robert knew better than that about me, even at the end, even when he could barely lift a coffee cup on his own. He made sure the world would know it too, whether I was ready to prove it myself or not. They thought grief would make me small. They thought a locked door and a signature on a listing agreement would be the end of the story. They forgot that some women don't get smaller when they're pushed. They get clearer. If this story meant something to you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you've ever had someone try to convince you that grief made you weak, when really, it just made you see clearly for the first time, I would genuinely love to hear about it. I'll see you in the next one.